The last thing I want to talk about is Nagel on tragic dilemmas. And, this is particularly relevant to war, which is why he brings it up in an essay on the ethics of war. But I think these could conceivably pop up elsewhere. And Nagel has some really interesting, if I think deeply disturbing things to say about tragic dilemmas. So before we get into that, though, let's talk about what Nagel thinks the proper relationship between Kantianism and utilitarianism is. So Nagel admits that both Kantianism and utilitarianism are part of the way we think about ethics. And you'll get some philosophers who want to say, well, Kantianism is the truth, utilitarianism is wrong. Some will say, well, utilitarianism, that's all we really care about. It can model everything, and Kantianism or some other theory that we care about. Stuff it can't model is just wrong. That is not Nagel's attitude. Nagel thinks that part of our thinking is Kantian, part utilitarian, and he thinks that for the most part they can fit together in a pretty sensible way. And this is what Nagel says. As long as actions don't violate the rights of others or treat them unfairly, that is, use them as a mere means, it is perfectly fine. It is, in fact, a good thing to create the most happiness. In fact, he would think that that's what policymakers, elected officials, appointed bureaucrats, he'd think that's generally what they should do. They shouldn't do things that use others as mere means, but generally speaking, we want them to create the most happiness for society as a whole, as long as they don't need to treat any other people as mere means to do that. But Nagel is very clear. He thinks that in our ordinary moral thinking, and he definitely endorses this view, he thinks that Kantianism should trump utilitarianism. If no one is treated as a mere means, we can and should do whatever creates the best consequences. But treating someone as a mere means is wrong. Fighting dirty is wrong, even if doing so would create great happiness or prevent incredible suffering. But what if doing something awful was, terrible was the only way to prevent something truly awful? Now, I don't think that the Hiroshima bombings really qualify as this, right? I tend to agree with Anscombe. The U.S. could have gotten some kind of surrender out of Japan by that point. And even if we couldn't, it wasn't like they were a threat anymore, right? Their Navy, their Air Force had been destroyed. They had never been able to bomb the U.S. mainland. It's just very hard to justify this in this framework. But, imagine a hypothetical historical scenario. Imagine the Nazis were winning the war, but we somehow developed an atomic bomb, or the British did, and it's start bombing German cities with atomic bombs, or maybe the Nazis take over the world. Or a more realistic case, and this actually was a rationale the English offered early in the war. In the early days of World War II, the Nazis were winning, and it looked like England might fall, Great Britain. And one of the British started pretty much indiscriminately bombing German cities. And one of the rationales for this was, well, look, we will fly our bombers at a very high altitude. We will destroy the Germans' industry. We will, undermine the public's trust in Hitler. And they'll have to spend resources defending against our bombing. Yes, this is wrong. It's one of the few ways to slow Hitler down. Now, I don't know about that. They kept up this indiscriminate bombing way later in the war when there was really no rationale for it. But in the early days of the war, you might think, it might seem reasonable that this indiscriminate bombing of German cities was the only way, one of the few ways to slow the Nazis down, maybe prevent a victory. What would Nagel say in cases like this? My hypothetical, the only way to stop the Nazis is the bomb, or the real world case where the British resorted to high altitude indiscriminate bombing. Now, what you would think Nagel would say is this. You should do some variation of this old Roman saying, do right though the heavens may fall, right? It is wrong to fight dirty no matter what, so don't do it. End of story. And I think this is what Anscombe would say, for reasons I'll come back to. I think this is what Anscombe would say. Murder is murder, and targeting civilians is murder. End of story. Would you boil a baby alive? If you say no, then don't do something in war similar. Here's what Nagel says, though. In some extraordinary cases, the least bad action might be the one that treats someone as a mere means. He is cagey about whether we have cases like this in actual history, but we could at least imagine, and there may well be, cases where fighting dirty, using someone as a mere means, is the least bad thing to do. If you had to drop atomic bombs on German cities, or let the Nazis win World War II and just murder hundreds of millions of people, maybe dropping a bomb on Nuremberg or Munich might not be off the table, right? Here's what Nagel says that's interesting, though. The action is still wrong. Person has acted wrongly and should feel guilty. I think we have this attitude of like, well, sometimes people have to do seemingly horrible things, and that takes guts and that takes strength, and they're weirdly admirable for it. The people that Anscombe blasts for saying Truman was courageous in dropping the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. That's not Nagel's attitude. Nagel thinks if you were to do this, in my hypothetical case, if you were to drop an atomic bomb on Munich or Berlin or Nuremberg, you would have done something horrible. It is the best thing to do. It's the least bad thing to do because it's better than the alternative, but you have still done something wrong. You should not feel proud. We should not praise you. In fact, you should feel guilty. And Nagel would say you've done something wrong because you have wronged other people who could justifiably blame you. If you drop an atomic bomb on Nuremberg, or even if you just firebomb Nuremberg or Munich, you have done something wrong, and the people you kill or the people who survive it, you have wronged them, you have treated them wrongly, and they would be justified in blaming you. And Nagel puts this in an interesting way. He talks about he doesn't quite call it this, but basically there's this could you look the victim in the eye test, right? And think about normal things in war, right? If some soldier in the German army, the Wehrmacht, was talking to an American veteran 10 years later, and he's like, well, you were shooting at me, the American could just say, well, you were shooting back, right? If he said, well, you shot me, I lost my arm, or you shot my best friend, I think the American could look him in the eye with no real shame and say, you were shooting at me, right? You were shooting my friends, right? There's the hostile relationship between us. And we'll often talk about this. After the war, sometimes Americans and German soldiers or Japanese soldiers would become friends. There doesn't seem to be anything all that weird about that. An American soldier could look a German soldier in the eye and justify what he was doing. That does not seem odd. But if you firebombed someone's city, Nagel thinks that even if this was the least bad thing to do, it would be weird if you could look the person in the eye. Could you say to somebody who said, well, I have these scars, I was burned, my mom and my father and mother, they were burned to death when Hamburg was bombed, or Hiroshima was bombed, could you say, well, now you see, I know that that's terrible, but let me explain. Doing that, it it made your side devote resources to defend your cities, and it destroyed industrial capacity. Or, well, the emperor wasn't going to surrender, we needed to send a message, so we had to burn your city. I mean, you understand, right? Nagel thinks that it would be just gross and disgusting and just wrong if you could look somebody in the eyes and say that without guilt. There is nothing wrong with being able to look somebody in the eyes and say without guilt, yes, I was shooting at you. Yes, I shot your comrades because you guys were shooting at me. There is something deeply wrong about being able to look a civilian in the eye and say, well, yeah, we targeted you, necessary military aims, bad time of things, right? Even in extraordinary cases, the civilians who were targeted would be wronged. They would be justified in blaming you or whoever did it, and a feeling of guilt would be appropriate. This means Nagel says that there are real tragic dilemmas. There may well be cases where you act wrongly no matter what you do. If it's bomb Hamburg or Nuremberg or Berlin or Munich, or let the Nazis win the war, it would be bad to let the Nazis win. Nagel thinks it would also be evil to bomb Hamburg or Munich or Berlin, right? All that might be open to you is to do the least bad thing, but no matter what you do, you deserve some level of blame and you should feel some level of guilt. Tragic dilemmas, the basic idea is damned if you do, damned if you don't. Now, I think incidentally, one thing that's interesting to note here, and I think this is decisive, is that Nagel is an atheist. And Anscombe isn't. Anscombe is very much a traditional Catholic. And Kant was not an atheist. He believed in God, though Kant's own particular form of religion is rather weird and rather well tailored to Kant's size by Kant himself, right? But I think both Anscombe and Kant would say they would endorse this do right though the heavens may fall line, right? Or I think both Anscombe and Kant would say do right and have faith, hope that the heavens won't fall. Because I think both of them believe, or at least hope, God has set up the world in such a way that we don't have to cross certain moral boundaries. Nagel has no such faith. When he says the world may well be an evil place, what he means is that the world may well put us in positions where we have done something morally blameworthy no matter what. Kant and Anscombe are not quite willing to open up that possibility. Nagel is, and I think he faces it very squarely. Now, you want to be clear, these situations where you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't, they are going to be extremely rare. And I don't think that Nagel would think that the Hiroshima-Nagasaki bombings were an example of that. I really don't. But they are possible, and if they pop up, you really might be damned if you do, damned if you don't. All right. So we will wrap up there with the ethics of war. And next section, we will move on to these issues of justice.